are bound to break me, but I ain't busted yet, 'cause I've been called a natural lover by that lady over there. Honey, I'm just a natural gambler, but I try to do my share. Go down gambling. Say it when you're running low.
Hey guys, Navinan on No Limit Hold'em. Had a member of my, one of the guys I'm coaching asked me to do a video on protocol and procedure and what it means to make a non-procedural play, or whether you ought to or should we follow protocol, what are the pros, what are the cons, and what's it all about. So that's this video. So why do we follow procedure in the first place? Can I really count on my opponents to c-bet his pre-flop razor? Do I really expect them to follow procedure? And if I do expect that, does that mean that I should? Is this just some kind of antiquated, strange poker thing that is kind of like having good form, the way that it used to be bad form in a lot of games to check raise? Is it something like that? No. in a word, no, it's not like that. And yeah, I mean, generally you can count on your opponent, who is the pre-flop raiser, to bet a lot of flops, and that definitely plays into the reason you ought to check to him to allow him to do that. So there's a lot of different reasons that we should tend to follow protocol, and protocol just means that if we were the last street aggressor, we should tend to bet on this street. If we were the last street's caller, we should check to last street's raiser. And if the procedural bettor doesn't bet and takes makes a non-procedural check back, for instance, on the flop, then normal game flow would be for us to lead a lot on the turn into him. That's all part of the normal flow of the game, and it's something we should generally, but not always, adhere to. One of the easiest ways to understand this concept is to think about it in terms of the pre-flop raise, or PFR, versus pre-flop caller, and how continuation betting works. So pre-flop raiser and pre-flop caller are representing different ranges. Pre-flop raiser has a wider range, it's not as, well, it's uncapped, it's not as bound, and it's going to tend to be more polarized. And if you don't understand any of these concepts, I think probably you're not going to understand game flow. And maybe this video is gonna go a little bit over your head. I mean, hang in there if you want. Maybe you'll get something out of it. But maybe you should look at I did this series called the Silver Bullet series, and I think all of that stuff is a really great way to. It's a great place to start if you're just starting to get to the point where you've decided to take the game seriously and you want to learn the deeper parts of strategy. There's concepts like polarization, the indifference principle, things like that are, I think I did a pretty good job of explaining those concepts in the Silver Bullet series. This is a very specific concept. If you're not clear on some of this stuff, I would just start somewhere else, honestly, and I don't ever say that, but I think this is a little bit more high level, it's a little more advanced to try to get your head around. But as PFC, our range is going to be more capped, more bound, more narrow. And it's going to be kind of a linear merged range compared to a polarized range. So what? Well, since calling ranges are typically going to be ranges that either hit in a big way or miss completely, and those hands are going to want to check to the raiser. And the other type of hand is going to be a hand that's going to tend to flop a lot of bluff catchers, like middle strength, top pair with a mediocre kicker, second pair with a decent kicker, or a top pair but where there's a lot of potential for there to be overpair, like a bluff catcher type hand, or a draw. And most of these hands are going to do better as checks than bets, whereas pre-flop raiser's range is going to be more bluff, more pure value. Pocket aces are always going to be a consideration for pre-flop raiser's range. They're usually not going to be in pre-flop caller's range. Same thing with pocket kings, but specifically aces. Pocket aces are always going to be at least an overpair, if not top set. So pre-flop raiser is going to have incentive to bet on a lot of flops. He's going to usually have incentive to bet most of his range on most flops. So pre-flop caller should typically check to the raiser for that very reason. And also, just, the reason being, that very reason is, if we knew that our opponent was going to bet for sure, we just check to him. We have no incentive to bet into a player that is definitely going to bet his entire range, right? I mean, if we have a middle strength hand, we want to check, let him bet his range, and call to catch bluffs. We can't make money betting our middle strength hands into a more polarized range. We can lose money that way. We can win the pot that way, but we can't get any value. And if we have a nut value hand, like a set, we're going to do better to check to the player, knowing he's going to put a bet in with his entire range, then check and raise there, or wait for another street and just check and call on this street and maybe wait for the turn to kind of pop the trap. I guess you could just leave it at that. I mean, if you don't have incentive to lead with your middle strength hands, and you don't have any incentive to lead your nutted value hands, then it can't make sense for you to just have bluffs when you do lead, or you're just turning your ranges face up. So that can't be. But even beyond that, just if we're playing this one hand in a vacuum against an opponent that we're definitely never going to play poker against for the rest of our lives, even then, in a vacuum, it is going to make more sense because your range is going to be more middle strength stuff with a couple of traps, and your opponent's range is going to be mostly bluffs and value hands with no bluff catchers, with less middle stuff, right? And that effect compounds. It adds up. As one player continues to aggress and the other player continues to comply, the player who's taking the more compliant line, his range is going to keep getting more narrowly defined, with less really strong hands and less weak hands and more mediocre hands. The player who continues to aggress, they're at every decision point where they make an aggressive action or take an aggressive action, their aggressive line at each decision point is removing some of the bluffs that they're giving up with, and it's taking some of the hands that wanted to bet for value on the flop, but that would have checked back on the turn for pot control, like hands that were value bets on the flop that have become showdown value on the turn. Those hands are checking back. The number of bluffs that you're supposed to give up with or decide to give up with on the turn, those hands are checking. And that leaves you with just some number of bluffs for balance against your better value hands. By the time this goes to the river, you're really, if it went pre-flop raise, pre-flop call, check to the razor, bet, call. The turn card comes out, check to the razor, bet, call. The river card comes out. We're very much in a polar versus bluff catcher situation that looks like this ace, king, queen game. So we definitely don't want to bet the king into an opponent who has either the ace or the queen. And by the time a player has raised pre-flop, or 3-bet pre-flop, or 4-bet pre-flop, and you've called, and you've checked him on the flop, and he's bet, you've checked him on the flop, and again on the flop, or on the turn, he has a chance to check back some of his showdown value type hands, or his thin value hands that he's going for just 2 streets, and he's declined. He's decided to bet instead. So each time he does that, the middle strength hands are falling out of his range, and the very strong and very weak hands are falling out of your range. So that by the time you make it to the river, you have the king, and he has an ace or a queen. Now, he could be bluffing or turning some showdown value hand into a bluff, either accidentally or doing it intentionally, and you might still have some traps that want to check jam the river, but mostly you're going to have, as the caller, your range is going to really start to resemble this bluff catcher, and he's going to have, either the ace or the queen most of the time. If you're not familiar with the ace, king, queen game, watch my video on indifference. I did a video called, I think it was called, Intro to Indifference. I believe that's it. Or there's one I did on, it's called Polarization, part of the Silver Bullet series. I think I did a pretty good job of laying these foundations out there. And really, guys, that's low-hanging fruit. If you don't understand this stuff, watch those videos and you'll instantly be better at poker, I promise. Not because I'm amazing, because the information is super important. And I do think I did a decent job of getting it across. I got a lot of positive feedback on those videos. So, the ace, king, queen game, just a way to conceptualize this is, if you have the king, like we're playing a game of poker with 3 cards. We have an ace, a king, and a queen. You're going to start with the king, and I'm going to start with either the ace or the queen because that's fair, right? I'm going to win half the time, you're going to win half the time, but we're not going to know who's who. So we're each going to ante $1, and then we're going to each have a check option or a bet option. And so you have the king, and you can choose to check it or bet, and then I can choose to check or bet my ace or queen. No, it's not fair at all, and I'm going to murder you. There's nothing you can do to win this game. You have the king. I know you have the king. I have the ace or the queen. You don't know which one I have. So when we're playing a game where there's betting and wagering involved, if one of us knows and the other doesn't know, and we're making a bet, then the player that has the information is going to win. So just for instance, if we ante $1 each, so there's $2 in the pot, then I can choose to, well, first of all, if you bet into me and I have the ace or the queen, I'm going to play perfectly against you. I'm not going to fold the ace. I'm not going to call you with the queen, right? So you're just setting money on fire if you decide to bet the king. But even if you play the way you're supposed to, and you know, like the optimal response is for you to check 100% of the time, and that's whether I check into you or if I bet, or if you're first. But let's just say you check the king, and I have the ace or the queen. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to bet $2 every time I have an ace, and I'm going to bet $2 half of the time I have a queen. And in that way, I'm making you indifferent between calling or folding because I'm laying you 2 to 1. There's $2 in the pot. I'm betting 2. That means $4 is in the pot. It costs you $2 to try to win it. You're getting 2 to 1. 4 to 2 is 2 to 1, right? And you're going to lose twice for every one time you win, which means you're breaking even, getting 2 to 1. Well, if you're breaking even, how am I winning? Because you're breaking even compared to folding. And if you fold, I win the money that's in the pot. So I'm making you indifferent between folding or calling. It's a break-even call. It's a break-even fold. You can fold, you can call. It doesn't matter. And if it doesn't matter if you fold or if you call and there's already $2 in the pot, then it's the same as me effectively winning the amount of money that is in the pot. And if we play the game long enough, that's what's going to happen. Unless I pick up on something you're doing wrong, in which case I can exploit you even worse than that. But what you should be doing is you should randomly call with the king half the time. You should always check it. And facing a bet, you should choose to call at random 50% of the time. That way I cannot make any unilateral adjustments to my strategy in order to increase my already positive expectation. If you decided, well, he's either got the ace or the queen, so I'm just going to call him because I'm getting 2 to 1 and it's a 50-50, then I can just stop bluffing you. And then every single time you call, you lose. Or if you're over folding, then I don't have to try to keep you indifferent. I can just bet everything. If you're folding too often, I can just bet all my aces and all my queens. But the best thing you can do is just 50% of the time at random call me, 50% fold. And the best thing I can do if you're doing that is to keep you indifferent by betting all of my aces and half of my queens. So 50% of the time that I get a queen, I bet it. 50% of the time I bet, you call. The game is at an equilibrium and I'm printing money. And you're not. You're losing money. And that's what polarization can do. Balance and polarization can do that. Now, when we're talking about polarization and trying to map this idea, the ace, king, queen game, over top of actual poker strategy, it maps pretty well. It's not perfect because, you know, it's not just the situation where one of us has 100% equity and the other has 0. Not till the river. We have equity distributions. But the closer we get to the river and the closer we get to a pure polar versus bluff catcher scenario, the closer our actual strategies ought to resemble the ace, king, queen game. And that is because of basic bet theory, which says the more I aggress, the more hands you fold. The more hands you fold, the stronger your range gets. But with your very strongest hands, you should be raising at some point also. So every time you do not fold, but do not raise, the top and bottom hands start to drop out of your ranges, and that leaves your range concentrated and contorted towards middle strength hands. You are value calling. That means that your hand is neither strong enough to raise or weak enough to fold. It's also probably not strong enough to raise. It's not strong enough to raise, but it's also probably not weak enough to raise as a bluff. So it probably is just a middle strength hand, and it will be the vast majority of the time against the vast majority of players on the vast number of runouts. This is something that you can just kind of take as the truth until you see somebody doing something differently. But if you have a range that raises pre-flop and another range that calls, and then on the flop, one range checks, the other range bets, the first range that checked now calls, the more this continues, the more this, the ranges become more and more polar, or more and more capped and bound. So the more check bet calls, the more aggression and the more compliance, the more one player is trying to just get their hand to showdown by putting in the least money possible, and the other player is trying to either get value from his the top of his range or put pressure on your hands with the bottom of his range, the more polarized his range becomes. So this is the effect that causes procedure in poker, or the basic game flow. Just like we wouldn't bet the king in the ace, king, queen game, we don't want to bet into a player who raised before the flop, saw us call. We saw the flop, we checked, he bet, we called, so he knows or ought to know that we have a bluff catcher. We don't have a bluff, we didn't raise. We're not repping a value hand, we didn't raise. We don't have, the top or bottom, we've got a middle strength hand. And he still is betting. So he does not have a middle strength hand. He either has a strong hand that's trying to get value from our middle strength hand, or he has a bluff that's trying to get us to fold. He's not going to have middle strength hands unless he's really bad and clueless and just happens to be aggressive to boot. So if he knows that we have like more or less a bluff catcher, and we know that he has more or less a polarized range, then if we bet into him, then it's like we're betting the king into the ace or the queen. It's all downside. Nothing good happens there. So should we follow protocol? Yeah, most of the time. There are some exceptions, and I guess we can talk about that a little bit. I don't want to get too far into that or too deep. The exceptions basically are, if we don't think our opponent understands poker, so we don't expect him to be making his own continuation bets or playing particularly well against our imbalances, then it can make sense for us to lead. Or when a flop or a board texture or a turn or a river hits in a way that really favors our range, even if we're playing against a very good player, and oftentimes especially if we're playing against a very good player, then even as pre-flop caller, we should be donk leading or making non-procedural leads on some flops. Like, let's say that we have a very good opponent, he's a very competent reg, he opens for 3 times the big blind from early position, everybody folds, it's full ring, we call out of the small blind and the big blind folds, and the flop comes out something like, so already our ranges are both pretty narrow, right? Especially if there's a bunch of fish at the table. Then we know this player who's pretty good is going to be opening from first position with a pretty tight and maybe somewhat face-up range. But he also should know, and this is particularly the case if the big blind is pretty much a fish, that when I call, I've got a pretty specific range. I'm very much capped and very bound, and he's going to be a little wider, but he's going to have a pretty tight range himself. And those ranges are going to be kind of obvious. They're going to look pretty, it's going to be narrowly defined ranges. When that flop comes out 8, 9, 10, as the big blind, if it's like 8, 9, 10 two-tone especially, I would say, then it can make a lot of sense for me to lead and develop a donk betting or a non-procedural betting range on the flop, because I'm going to have some value hands that want 3 streets, and if my opponent's really, really good, he might just check his entire range back on a flop like that, knowing that he's going to be capped at like pocket aces. Maybe if the flop was 10, 9, 8 or 9, 8, 7, this would be even more the case. So his range is going to be mostly capped at like an overpair. And so if he checks back the flop, then he can call down turns and rivers with a lot of hands. And even if he does happen to have one of his few nut value hands, it still probably is going to be the case that he should just check back his entire range to rep, just to not turn his hand face up. and allow us to do what we're probably going to do, which is continue to follow procedure. And it's also part of procedure that once the player who had the lead gives up the lead, he has capped his range, and so protocol would be, or game flow would dictate that I now lead into or take the lead from the player who gave up the lead. And it makes sense. It's not like just having good manners or some like ancient idea about just a silly idea for playing poker. This is not like how it used to be bad form to check raise. This is something strategic, and it's something that makes sense. But there is this protocol. It does make sense. And one of the big things is, if I know my opponent is likely to bet, then I don't have any incentive to do that myself, right? And if my opponent has incentive to bet, then he probably is going to, you know? I mean, if he's got enough incentive to do it, then he's going to do it, if he's any good, right? You can expect him to. You can play with the assumption that he's going to. Basic bet theory, basic value calling principles. You know, that's what it comes down to. So, like, by the time a player has raised pre-flop, bet flop, bet turn, and we get to the river, the player who's been doing the calling, his range is so narrowly defined. And the player who's been doing the raising and betting, his range is so polarized. You're not going to take that line with a hand like second pair, right? You're not going to raise pre-flop with king, queen, watch the flop come ace, queen, 9, rainbow, and just start barreling off with second pair, right? You're not going to bet flop, bet turn, bet river with second pair. And the player who sees that flop come out ace, queen, 7, rainbow, or ace, queen, 9, two-tone, or whatever, he's not going to have like pocket twos and call down with it. He's not going to have some kind of a like error that just calls flop, calls turn, and then checks the river. Not very often, you know, you wouldn't expect it. It's not supposed to be there. And since that's the case, the more aggressive actions that are taken by one player and the bigger the bets are, and the more compliant actions, the more compliant the line is from the other player, and again, especially the bigger the bets are from the aggressor, the more narrowly defined one player's range is, and the more his hand starts to look like the king in the ace, king, queen game, the more polarized the other player's distribution is, and the closer it starts to get to this 100 versus 0 equity distribution. The only, well, especially on the river. Once we get to the river, you know, we can say some things, right? If you bet the flop, like let's say you raised pre-flop and I called, then you bet the flop and I called, and you bet the turn and I called, like I check called flop, check called turn, and we get to the river, I'm not bluffing. Makes sense, right? I haven't raised you, I'm not bluffing. And I'm not repping a nut value hand. A lot of the nut value hands I have would have raised pre-flop, depending on the board, you know, but like my pocket aces, pocket kings, a lot of my overpairs and top sets would have raised pre-flop. A lot of my nut value hands would have check raised the flop. Some of them would have check raised the turn. By the time we get to the river, I probably don't have a whole lot of sets. I probably don't have a lot of bullshit air. You know, my weak draws folded either raised or folded at some point before this most of the time. My strong draws probably raised or folded or missed by now, right? So I don't have a lot of those. You don't have to worry about many. You don't have a bluff catcher. Again, you're not barreling off a second pair. You're not barreling off, I hope, with top pair with a weak kicker even. But you could have nutted value and you could have air. And if one of us has a range that's very much nutted value and air, and the other one has a range that's very much bluff catcher, then one of us has the king and the other has the ace or the queen, and we don't bet the king into the ace or the queen. That's where the flow comes from. Again, there are times that we want to break protocol, but just remember, when you choose to break protocol and take a non-procedural line, you're, in a lot of ways, you're turning your hand face up. You know, we don't learn that much on any given decision point about what kind of hand our opponent has. As long as he's following procedure, following game flow, he's keeping his entire continuing range in check very often. In balance, or intact, I should say, very often, by just following protocol, just going with the normal game flow of things. But as soon as one of us takes a non-procedural line or option, we give some very serious information off about our hand. Let's use an example first that's not even on the board here. Let's say that I raise, let's go back to two competent players in a 2-5 cash game at the local casino, surrounded by fish, and you're all 150 big blinds deep. And I raise from under the gun to 4 times the big blind, and you call from the small blind, and we go heads up. And the flop comes ace, 7, deuce, rainbow. You check to the razor, and I check back. Well, how? I mean, I don't have air, right? I would have bet my air. That is a very hard board for you to call down on. And it's a very, very hard board for me to miss. You know, and even if I did miss it, I should be bluffing it. So when I don't bet, I probably don't have ace king. I probably don't have, you know, like a value hand. Because why would I not just bet the value hands? It's not like it's going to tell you anything. You know, if you know I'm going to bet my bluffs, then it doesn't give you any information for me to bet ace king also. So when I check back, it does tell you something. It tells you something very specific. It tells you that I don't have a hand that is strong enough to value bet. I don't have a hand that is weak enough to bluff. If I know what I'm doing, I'm going to have showdown value, like, I don't know, something like pocket kings on this board that I don't think can go 3 streets for value, but I'm happy to call down 2 streets. Or I can start value betting turns, having under-repped my hand on the flop, or pot controlled on the flop. Yeah, and I can have a couple of traps. You're going to run into a trap every once in a while. If I'm very, very good, and I think you're very, very good, then I'm going to have exactly pocket kings down to 8s on ace, 7, deuce. In fact, I might just bet 8s as a bluff. Because I won't have that many pure bluffs if I open in this scenario, so maybe I'm just betting 8s, maybe even 9s, checking 10s, jacks, queens, and kings back. Whatever, like ace-king type stuff I have, ace-queen, ace-jack, I'm going to bet that. So when I check back, I've either got one of my middle strength hands, or I'm probably also going to check back exactly pocket aces against a good player. And that's my range, you know, that's what it is. So my range just got very specific. Because of what? Because I took a non-procedural line. So the only time we should really be taking non-procedural bets or checkbacks is when we can't help but do it, because we're just bleeding off too much value or EV to not do it. But we can't help but give away information when we do choose to do this. So as a general rule, you should wait till the last minute to split your ranges. You don't want to give your opponent any information that you don't have to. But when I say don't have to, what I mean is the very last minute is you want to keep your ranges intact and not separate or split your ranges until you have to. And by have to, I mean until it would cost you EV to not do it. Like, I don't want to be betting the king myself, you know. So if I have pocket kings, I don't want to be pre-flop razor from under the gun and bet pocket kings necessarily on ace, 7, deuce, rainbow. Seems like kind of betting the king in the ace, king, queen game, right? And the other place to break protocol is just like when a very, like, let's say I'm pre-flop caller and I check and call on the flop, and the turn card comes off and it, like, maybe it's exactly pairs the middle card on the flop. That's very good for the caller. Like, let's say the flop comes out like ace, 10, 5 rainbow in that same kind of scenario, and the big blind checks, and this time the pre-flop raiser from early position does bet, and pre-flop caller calls, and then the turn card comes at 10. Well, that's going to hit my range as the caller harder than it hits your range, pre-flop raiser. So maybe I lead there, but maybe not, because remember, I am breaking protocol to do that and turning my hand face up, right? So, but it could be acceptable. Maybe we'd want to lead there with our trip 10s. If we call with ace 10 suited pre-flop, maybe we'd lead our boats and then have some bluffs in there too, whatever draws we have. But you know, even at that, you might be just better off checking your trips and your draws and going for the check raise with your trips and with your draws, and maybe even waiting till the river to check raise your full house couple combos. Yeah, 2 combos of full houses, and then like maybe a combo of some kind of a bluff or something to turn into a bluff against the bet. But by and large, you want to follow protocol. Follow the game flow. Follow the normal procedure of check to the razor, bet if check to as razor. check to the last street aggressor, and if somebody gives up the lead, take it. That's the general game flow. And it's not always the case that you should do that, but it is most of the time, and that's because of the information game. And it's because of not ever wanting to bet the king into a polarized range. If you have a bluff catcher, you don't want to bet a bluff catcher into a polarized range. Nothing good can come of that. Nothing good happens when you bet a middle strength hand into a range that's either nutted value or air, right? They're not going to call you with air. They're not going to fold nutted value. So here's another example. Villain opens 3 times the big blind from the button. You call out of the big blind with 100 big blinds effective to start. The flop is queen 10, 7, rainbow. This probably favors the big blind's calling range by a little bit, not by a lot. Definitely not enough to where we'd want to start donk leading. We're not afraid that pre-flop Razor's going to check his range back here. We expect he's probably got a lot of the same value hands that we have, like really good, strong hands. He'll have like probably queen 10 suited, 10-7 suited, maybe pocket 7s, pocket 10s, which we may not have pocket 10s actually. We might 3-bet those pre-flop. But he's got all this other stuff too. He's got pocket queens, we don't. He's got, we can probably both have king queen, although I'm going to sometimes 3-bet king queen in this spot. It depends on my opponent, my image, and whatever, whatever else. But he can have ace queen. We would have 3-bet that pre-flop. He can have pocket queens. We would have 3-bet that pre-flop. We could probably both have some combos of king jack. Yeah, I mean, I think I flat king jack mostly versus button open, but some players will 3-bet it from the big blind. I don't think it's a mistake. I just think it's a difference of splitting hairs, kind of a stylistic difference. Pre-flop Razor has pocket kings, we don't. Pre-flop Razor has pocket aces, we don't. So we definitely don't have a range advantage in terms of, like, we don't have a nut advantage. But we've got plenty of draws, we've got plenty of, like, you know, decent pairs. We've got maybe ace 10, king 10, queen jack, you know, that kind of stuff that's going to check and call happily. So yeah, we should do that. We should check, and we do. In this example, we check, our opponent bets 5, and we call 5. So what's happened? What's happened to our ranges? Now what? Well, now, some of my bad hands, some of your bad hands, but remember, we're the player that's out of position that called pre-flop. Our worst hands have folded, some of our best hands have raised, and our middle hands have called. So what do we have? Well, we've got mostly middle strength hands. Queen jack, ace 10 type stuff, maybe some draws. So now the turn card comes off and it's a king. What does our opponent have? Well, he's more polarized. He's even more polarized than he was before the flop hit, and he's more polarized than he was before he bet the flop. Not just because of this king, but that does it too. So when the flop comes queen 10 7, we can expect pre-flop Razor to check back his hands that are now middle strength showdown value and just bet some number of bluffs to balance against his value bets. So his range is more and more starting to look like the ace or the queen. Our range is starting to more and more, little by little, look more and more like the king. The turn card comes out, it's the king of diamonds, we check again, he bets again. Now, I mean, that is a good card for his range. He still has pocket kings, he still has king queen, he still has ace king that probably would have bet his gut shot on the flop. Probably. Depends on the player, but, you know, probably. He still has his sets, he still has, pocket kings just turned into a set, pocket aces still has a value bet. But now his hands like ace queen might check back. So now his showdown value type middle strength hands, once he bets the turn, are dropping out of his range. And whatever bluffs he had that he decided to give up with are dropping out of his range. Some of his draws are starting to get there. Some of his airs starting to turn into draws. But his betting range is looking more and more like the ace or the queen, polarizing more and more starkly, more contrasted, I guess. His range is getting more and more divided. The center hands are falling little by little out of this range. And the opposite is true of us. Again, now here we are on the turn. There's 3 Broadway cards. We have called the flop. We checked the turn. He bet. There's 2 diamonds. So this is getting more and more dangerous for us to continue slow playing big hands. So we probably would have check raised some of our monster hands on the flop. We might check raise the rest of our monster hands on the turn if we're not worried about being exploited for it. Or maybe we just leave like whatever our very, very best hand is, like I guess ace jack if we don't 3-bet it pre-flop. Maybe we check call with that again, just to make sure we've got some kind of a trap left to have on the river. But most players don't even think like that. Most of the time, if the flop has a queen, a 10, and a king with 2 diamonds, they are not going to slow play a straight. They are not going to slow play a set. They're not going to get, too cute and fancy because everybody's so worried about protecting their hand, right? Whether or not we should be is a decision for another video, but let's just say people don't do it very often. And I would say they don't do it as often as they ought to. So once this river card comes out and it's the 3 of clubs and you lead into me, what am I to make of that? What am I to make of that? I mean, what is that? It tells me something, right? You just split your range in a big way. You don't have a bluff catcher. If you do, you just turned it into a bluff, and that's bad poker. Unless there's a reason to turn it into a bluff. Like you're going to get to some spot where you don't have enough actual bluffs to turn, so you have to turn some of your showdown value into bluffs, and I would argue that's almost certainly not the case here. If you have any kind of sensible big blind defending range, that is, I'll say certainly not the case on this river. What's your story, man? You don't have pocket 3s that called the flop, called the turn, and now they're not going to check raise the river, they're just going to lead it. It looks like, when you see a player do this, I'll tell you what it looks like. For me, I think they have exactly a hand that does not want to check and call and does not want to check and fold. So that, to me, looks like a hand like Queen X, second pair. And I'm not going to make mistakes against that hand. So the bluffs that I was going to make, maybe I fold most of them. Maybe I take my most pristine bluffs, the ones that have the absolute best blockers, like a jack with no diamonds or something like that. So it doesn't block the combo draws you might have decided to turn into a bluff, and it does block the nuts. Maybe a hand with like the ace of diamonds and some other card would be good. So whatever my best bluffs are, I might go ahead and just raise those and fold most of the hands I was going to bluff you with, so you're missing the value you would have got by checking and calling. And then I'm going to take my actual nutted value hands and I'm going to raise those, and I'm going to take my thin value hands and I'm going to raise those because your range looks so face up. So I'm going to play very good against you. So typically don't do this, unless that river card was specifically good for your range and or bad for mine. You shouldn't lead it. You shouldn't break protocol for no good reason. In the last example, villain opens small blind and you 3-bet from the big blinds. We're in this battle the battle of the blinds, so to speak. Villain opens, you 3-bet, and he calls. He calls. Out of position. Is he bluffing? He's not, right? Does he have pocket aces? Does he have pocket aces? I mean, he can open raise pocket aces from the small blind, but once you 3-bet him, is he just going to flat pocket aces? He's out of position. You're in the blinds. You guys should have wide ranges. I very seriously doubt he's going to expect you to fold kings, queens, ace, king, and you might spaz out. He shouldn't have aces. Do you have king 10 suited? Probably not. You probably should just be flatting king 10 suited, right? So when this flop comes out, it's ace 3-2 rainbow, and he leads into you. What in the hell? What is this? It's something. It means something. And if you get to see one of these hands go to showdown, there is so much information to pick up on and glean from that is a treasure trove. You can not only figure out what they had in this hand and what their thought process was in this hand, but you can get information about how they think about poker at large. When you see a non-procedural line take place and you get to see that showdown, you should really understand your opponent's mindset after that. And if you don't, then you need coaching with me. Which, by the way, I think this is going to about wrap this up, but this is a video that I was asked to do by one of my students, so that's just another reason you should get coaching from me. I mean, guys, really, it's cheap. I do a very inexpensive... I'm not by any means trying to go full-time with it. I have business ventures I'm into. I play poker, I do business, I do coaching, but very inexpensive. I do things like make videos for my students. They've got a strategy thread that I kind of maintain, and we do like a hand of the night, and maybe you've seen some of those because sometimes I do videos of them and then put them onto the thread. Sometimes we just do it via text, like text as opposed to a video. We use the WhatsApp application for the strategy forum. It's kind of like just a miniature personal version of 2+2, the poker forum. But it's kind of a close-knit group of guys and gal. We've got any given day probably 3 people conversing, up to no more than 5. And I like to keep it like that. I don't want to have more than 5 people on there at a time, but right now in an average day we'll get like myself and then maybe 2 others or 3 others, every once in a while 4. It has happened 5, but usually not. I'd say I'd like to pick up 2 more students, and it's $20 an hour for sessions, and plus just all these other perks and benefits, and that the hours are not an hour. I very, 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 very. I don't even think I rarely do an hour session in 1 hour. I think I literally have never not gone over. So it's a good value, guys. And so here you go, Greg. Hopefully that was helpful to you, and hopefully to anybody else it's helpful, and it just incentivizes you just a little tiny bit more to get coaching and get into our group. It adds value for everybody. And until next time, guys, good quote, Luck, and quote. Over and out.